The mop hit the floor with a dull thud, and Doug pounced almost instantly, like a predator that had just caught the scent of weakness. "Useless old man," Doug snarled, his voice full of contempt. "Can't even hold a mop straight." Walt bent down, struggling to pick it up, but his hands trembled too violently to grip it properly. Kellen instinctively stepped forward to help, but Doug shoved him aside with a sneer. Let him figure it out himself. Walt's face crumpled, not just from the shame but from the unbearable weight of exhaustion and humiliation. His breathing grew shallow and uneven. Then, right there on the stockroom floor, he collapsed, shoulders quaking, silent tears rolling down his cheeks. Kellen stood frozen, his pulse thudding in his ears. He had worked alongside janitors before. He knew their worth, respected their grit. But this wasn't just unfair. It was dehumanizing. And it was happening right here, in his own company, in the walls of something he had built from the ground up with values he thought were unshakable. Doug scoffed, rolling his eyes as if this were just another minor inconvenience. "Oh, come on, quit crying. You think anybody actually gives a damn?" Kellen clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had seen enough, but he couldn't blow his cover, not yet. So instead, he crouched beside Walt, speaking quietly. "Do you have anyone you can call? Someone who can pick you up?" Walt gave a slight shake of the head. His voice, when it came, was hollow. "Just me." Kellen felt something twist deep in his gut. No backup. No family, just an aging man being bullied by the very boss who was supposed to look out for him. Doug let out an exaggerated sigh. If he can't work, he can go home, but he's not getting paid for today. Kellen took a long breath, steadying his voice. "I'll cover his shift. Let him go home." Doug narrowed his eyes. "You? You're just a temp." "Then fire me," Callum shot back. "But he's not staying." Doug stared him down, but didn't argue. "Fine, whatever. But if I see him sitting around again, he's done." Callan gently helped Walt to his feet, his hand steadying the man's trembling shoulder. Together they walked toward the back exit. As they reached the door, Walt wiped at his eyes, his voice barely a whisper. "You didn't have to do that." Callan forced a faint smile. "Yeah, I did." As Walt disappeared into the daylight beyond the loading dock, Kellen turned back toward the store, his jaw set, his chest heavy. Something inside him had shifted. Doug had mistaken silence for permission, and that mistake was about to cost him everything. Because Kellen had finally seen the truth with his own eyes, and he wasn't walking away from it, not this time. Walt bent down to pick it up, but his hands were shaking too violently to manage. Kellen instinctively stepped forward, but Doug shoved him aside, his eyes cold and dripping with disdain. "Let him deal with it himself. If he's too weak, he doesn't belong here." Walt hunched over, his shoulders trembling, and then, as if every ounce of strength had been drained from him, he slumped to the floor. He covered his face, but not before Kellen caught sight of the tears slipping down his cheeks. They weren't tears of weakness. They were tears of humiliation, despair, and the crushing weight of being pushed beyond the edge. Doug simply rolled his eyes as if the entire scene was some kind of joke. "Oh, come on. Stop crying like a baby. You really think anyone gives a damn?" Kellen stood there, heart like a stone, fists clenched. He'd worked with janitors before, always respected them, viewed them as some of the most honorable people in any business, quietly keeping everything running behind the scenes. But now, in his own company, a man was being treated like garbage, like he didn't matter. Lowering his voice, Kellen sat down beside Walt. "Do you have anyone who can come pick you up? Family? Friends?" Walt just shook his head, eyes still wet. "No one, it's just me." That answer cut Kellen to the core. Here was a man near the end of his working years, no backup, no support, being worked to exhaustion, and then humiliated in front of everyone. Doug curled his lip. If he can't work, he can go home, but don't expect to get paid for today. Kalen took a long, calming breath, suppressing the storm rising inside him. I'll take over his shift. Let him go home. Doug raised an eyebrow, smirking. You're just a temp. You trying to get yourself fired? Then fire me, Kellen replied, eyes locked on Doug's. But he's not staying another minute. Doug huffed, shrugging. Fine, but if I see him sitting around again, he's done. Kellen helped Walt to his feet, guiding him slowly toward the exit. At the threshold, Walt hesitated, his voice quiet and uncertain. You didn't have to do that. I did, Kellen answered, his voice steady with resolve. Walt left in silence, and Kellen stood there, staring around the store like he was seeing it for the first time. Cracks were everywhere. Not in the walls or floors, but in the people, in the culture. Doug thought he could treat human beings like they were disposable. Not anymore. Kellen spent the rest of his shift silently watching and absorbing everything. The way employees barely spoke, the way they avoided eye contact, the way customers left, looking irritated and disappointed. By closing time, the front of the store looked like a disaster zone. Shopping carts left abandoned by the registers, shelves in disarray, trash scattered across the floor. The employees were moving like they had nothing left to give, drained and defeated. And Doug? Still holed up in his office, scrolling on his phone, completely oblivious. Or worse, indifferent. Helen noticed a young cashier. She couldn't have been more than 17, struggling to count out her drawer. She counted, then recounted, her face pale with panic. Doug suddenly appeared behind her, looming. You short? She jumped. I'm not sure. Maybe I miscounted. Then count again, and if it's still short, it's coming out of your paycheck. Her face went white. But that's not company policy. Doug shrugged. My store, my rules. Can't handle it? Don't come back tomorrow. She looked down, blinking fast as tears welled up, but continued counting. Kellen felt a slow, burning fire rise in his chest. It wasn't just anger. It was shame. Shame that he'd allowed people like Doug to exist in a company he had poured his heart into. The place wasn't just broken. It had been weaponized against the very people who kept it alive. After his shift, Kellen walked out to his car and sat for a long time. He looked back at the store, a heavy weight pressing on his chest. This wasn't just bad leadership, this was abuse. A festering rot eating away at the values he'd built the company on. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant. How was the shift? Lauren asked. Bad, Kellen said, his voice hoarse. I need a full report on Doug, work history, complaints, turnover under his management. Everything. Lauren hesitated. That bad? No, Kellen replied grimly. Worse. And pull every exit interview from the past year. I want to know why people really left. Got it. I'll have it for you by morning. Kellen ended the call and exhaled slowly. He had suspected things were bad, but what he'd seen with his own eyes went far beyond his worst fears. The next morning he arrived early. As usual, Doug was nowhere to be found. Employees began their shifts in silence. No conversation, no eye contact, just quiet resignation. Kellen made his way to the stockroom, where a group of workers stood near the loading dock, their expressions tense and uncertain. Is something wrong? He asked. A thin young man in an oversized vest replied. Doug was supposed to be here when the truck arrived, but like always, he didn't show. Do you guys have equipment to unload this? Yeah. But Doug says using the pallet jack takes too long, so we carry everything by hand, and if anything breaks, we get blamed for it. Kellen glanced at the boxes, some of them heavy, others marked fragile. He nodded. Let me help. For the next hour, Kellen worked alongside them, unloading box after box, sweat soaking through his shirt. At first, the employees were cautious, but as time passed, they started to ease up. One of them chuckled softly. You're pretty quick for the new guy. Kellen gave a modest smile. I just can't stand seeing things done the wrong way. Just as they finished, Doug finally appeared. He took one glance at the neatly stacked boxes, his face void of gratitude. Took you long enough. What were you doing, crawling? The worker clenched his hard hat tighter but didn't say a word. Doug turned to Kellen. You've got so much energy. Clean the break room. It's a damn mess. Kellen nodded, swallowing the anger rising in his throat. It wasn't time yet. The break room was exactly as Doug had said. Overflowing trash bins, leftover food stinking up the space, chairs and tables scattered haphazardly. As Kellen cleaned, he caught whispers from the hallway. Did you hear? Walt quit. Kellen froze. Doug worked him to the bone, poor guy. He needed someone in his corner. In that moment, all of Kellen's restraint gave way to something heavier. Regret. Walt hadn't just walked out. He had been driven away, forced to leave the place that once felt like a second home, cast out without anyone to speak up for him. But this time, Kellen would speak. Gripping the edge of the counter as if to ground himself, Kellen closed his eyes for a second. Walt wasn't just on a break. He was gone, pushed out, like he no longer had any worth. And the man responsible, Doug, was still walking around, unchecked. That was it, the final straw. Kellen finished the last bit of cleaning, dried his hands and walked straight to Doug's office without saying a word. No knocking, no hesitation. He opened the door and closed it firmly behind him, sealing the space in an almost suffocating silence. Doug looked up, coffee cup in hand, legs kicked up on the desk, wearing the smug expression of someone enjoying an easy day. Lost or something? Kellen's voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the air like a blade. No, but you're about to be. Doug raised an eyebrow and let out a dry laugh. What the hell are you talking about? Without a word, Kellen reached up and removed his cap. Then he stood tall, straightening his back, letting the truth of who he was fill the room. Doug's expression morphed from amusement to confusion, then to horror. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair. His eyes darted toward the door, like a man trying to calculate his escape route from a reality he never expected. Because standing in front of him wasn't just another janitor, it was the owner of the company. The man who had built the entire system from the ground up. Kellen let the silence stretch like a weight pressing down on the room, watching as Doug squirmed. How long have you been managing this store? Kellen asked, his tone calm but thunderous underneath. 7 years, Doug stammered, trying to reclaim some authority. I've kept this place running. Kellen nodded slowly. 7 years. And in all that time, you've built a culture of fear. You've pushed good people to their limits, and you've turned this location into the worst performing store in the entire chain. Doug flinched, then tried to interrupt. Wait, hold on. Kellen raised his hand, stopping him. I don't need to hear excuses. I've seen enough. The way you speak to employees, the way you pretend not to notice glaring problems, the way you pushed someone like Walt to his breaking point, only to humiliate him in front of everyone. Doug tilted his head back and let out a dismissive laugh. Walt, the guy was slow, weak, couldn't handle the job. Kellen kept his composure, but his voice grew heavier. He'd worked 3 consecutive shifts because you gave him no other option. He collapsed in the stock room from exhaustion, and instead of helping him, you chose to humiliate him. That's not leadership. That's cruelty. Doug leaned back in his chair, trying to appear relaxed. This is retail, not some cushy office job. You want to survive? You toughen up. I run the store the way it needs to be run." Kellen stepped closer, his gaze cutting straight through the pretense. "No. You run it the way that's easiest for you. You sit in your office while your employees break down. You make up policies just to bully and dock people's pay. That ends now." Dog started to tremble slightly, though he tried to maintain his bravado. "I've been here longer than most of those kids out there. I know what works and what doesn't. You think just because you played janitor for a day, you understand everything? You can't just walk in here and flip the place upside down?" Kellen nodded once. "I've been too removed from the front lines, I admit it. I trusted managers to do their jobs and never checked for myself. That ends today." Doug stared at him. "So what now? You gonna fire me?" Kellen's voice was cold and clear. "Yes." Doug's face paled, though he tried to cover it with a smirk. "Big mistake. You fire me, this place will fall apart. I'm the one holding it together." Kellen tilted his head slightly. "No, the employees you've looked down on are the ones holding it together. They've kept this place running, not because of you, but in spite of you." Doug stiffened. He had no more defense. Kellen calmly picked up the phone on the desk and dialed a number. Moments later, a security officer entered the room. Kellen nodded toward Doug. "Escort him out. HR will be in touch to finalize the paperwork." Doug jumped to his feet, his face flushed red with anger, but he didn't say a word. He shot Kellen a glare as he stormed past the officer and out of the office. Once the door closed behind him, Kellen finally let out his first real breath in hours. But the work was far from over. He walked back onto the store floor. Employees had gathered, clearly startled. They hadn't heard every word, but they'd heard enough to know that something had shifted. Permanently. Kellen stood before them, his voice steady but humble. "Dog is gone." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. "I've seen with my own eyes what's been happening here, and I take full responsibility for not stepping in sooner. But that changes today. Starting now. No more unpaid overtime. No more being forced to cover shifts without your consent. No more threats over honest mistakes." The young cashier from the night before, still uncertain, spoke up softly. "So things are actually going to change?" Kellen looked her in the eyes. "Yes, and it starts now." He turned to the assistant manager, a woman named Rachel. Someone who had quietly tried to hold things together under Doug's oppressive rule. "I want a full staff meeting. I want to hear from all of you what's broken, what needs fixing, and what ideas you have to make this a better place. Anyone who was forced to work extra hours will be compensated, and if anyone has ever been mistreated, my door is open." The tension in the room slowly began to shift. Worry gave way to something new, cautious hope. An older employee folded his arms and asked, not unkindly, "What happens when you leave? How do we know things won't just go back to the way they were?" Kellen nodded, understanding the skepticism. "That's a fair question, which is why I'm not just making promises. I'm restructuring store leadership. We'll bring in someone new, someone who understands the value of a team, and I'll be here, regular visits, direct oversight." "I won't let this happen again." The young cashier gave a small smile. "Then I guess we'll see if you mean it." Kellen smiled back, gently. "I want you to hold me to it." The next morning, Kellen returned early. As he walked through the aisles, the signs of long-term neglect were everywhere. Empty shelves, mismatched price tags, a stockroom that looked like a war zone. It wasn't the employees' fault. This was what happened when people were pushed past their limits and left without support. Rachel arrived not long after, still looking wary. Her voice was careful. "And so what now?" Kellen turned to face her directly. "Now we rebuild, but I need to know, what do you and the team need to succeed?" Rachel paused, clearly choosing her words. "People are burned out, The schedule's a mess because we're always short-staffed, and the ones who stay, they don't trust management anymore. Not after everything. How do we earn back their trust? Kellen asked. Consistency? Rachel replied. Not just promises, but action. Repeated, visible action. People need to believe that we're not just replacing one bad boss with another who'll forget about them in a month. Those words struck Kellen deeply. He knew the real challenge wasn't making a quick fix. It was making change last. He called the regional office. Within a few hours, an HR representative arrived to assist. Kellen sat down with each employee, listening to their stories. At first, they were hesitant, guarded, but gradually the conversations grew more honest, more vulnerable. One employee, a young man named Lewis, looked him straight in the eye. Are you really going to change things, or is this just another meeting that goes nowhere? Kellen nodded. If I wasn't serious, I wouldn't be sitting here. Lewis exhaled. Then stop making us choose between our jobs and our health. If someone calls out, the rest of us shouldn't have to pay for it. Kellen understood. Walt hadn't been an exception. He had been a warning bell, ringing louder than the rest. By the end of the day, Kellen's notebook was filled with page after page of observations, frustrations, and chances to make things right. And the first change happened immediately. The schedule was restructured. No one would be forced into extra shifts they didn't agree to. Kellen didn't stop at promises. He moved straight into action. Emergency coverage policies were put in place, so no employee would be penalized for needing time off due to illness or personal matters. But real change needed to go deeper. He introduced broad reforms, comprehensive training for management, transparent policies that protected workers, and a new mandate. Managers were required to be present on the floor, not hidden in their offices. And slowly, the atmosphere in the store began to shift. Staff were still cautious, still watching, but there was a glimmer of belief. This time, maybe, things really would get better. But Kellen knew there was still one thing left to do. One thing he couldn't ignore. 2 days later, he stood outside a worn-down apartment complex on the edge of town. He knocked. After a short pause, the door creaked open. It was Walt. Wearing a plain sweater, his posture softer than it had been at work, though his eyes still carried the weight of exhaustion. Kellen didn't waste time. I came to apologize. Walt raised an eyebrow but said nothing. You gave so much to that store, Kellen continued. You deserved more respect than you were given. I should have seen what was happening much sooner. Walt sighed, scratching the back of his neck. Doesn't change the past. No, Kellen agreed, shaking his head. But it doesn't have to stay that way. I'm not asking you to come back, but if you ever need a job, the door's open. And I've made sure you're being paid for every hour you worked, even the ones Doug tried to take from you. Walt's expression softened slightly. Well, that's something. Kellen handed him an envelope. This is something extra, no strings, a bonus for the time and effort you gave. Walt hesitated, then took it. He peeked inside, his expression unreadable. After a long moment, he nodded quietly. I appreciate that. Kellen nodded back. Take care of yourself. As he walked away down the quiet street, Kellen felt the weight of the past few days settle on his shoulders. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could make sure it never happened again. The next morning, he returned to the store. The break room had been fully renovated. A faint scent of fresh paint still hung in the air. It no longer looked like a forgotten, neglected space. It had been repainted in warm tones, with clean tables, comfortable seating, and a stocked snack bar tucked into the corner. Not far away, Rachel stood reviewing paperwork. When she saw Kellen enter, she handed him a stack of employee feedback forms. He flipped through the pages. Some responses were cautious, some optimistic, but the pattern was clear. People were beginning to believe this change might actually be real. Rachel crossed her arms. It's better. People aren't afraid to ask questions anymore, but there's still hesitation. They're waiting to see if this actually lasts. Bill nodded. That's fair. Trust doesn't come from words. It comes from doing the right thing over and over again. Rachel was quiet for a beat, then added, Lewis mentioned something else. There were payroll errors a few months ago. A lot of people were shorted on hours, but Doug always brushed it off. Ellen's face darkened. I'll have Lauren audit the entire payroll system. If anything's wrong, we'll fix it. It means a lot to everyone that you're taking this seriously, Rachel said before stepping out of the room. Ellen sat down, his eyes returning to the stack of employee feedback. Change was happening, but there was still so much work to be done. That afternoon, he sat in his office, reviewing the financial report Lauren had sent over. With every line he read, his anger deepened. The payroll discrepancies weren't minor mistakes. They were part of a deliberate system of fraud. Lauren's voice came through the speakerphone. I triple-checked everything. Doug was manipulating the system. After each shift, he'd alter the time logs. Some people lost just a few minutes, but others lost entire shifts. For how long? Kellen asked. At least a year, possibly longer. Kellen closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. Bring in an independent auditor. I want a full forensic review, and everyone who was shorted gets reimbursed, with interest. Lauren hesitated. This could lead to legal trouble. They have every right to take legal action, Kellen said firmly. Our job is to make it right before they have to. By the end of the week, Kellen stood in front of the entire store team, gathered in the stockroom. The air was tense, everyone expecting the worst. I'm not here to make a speech, Kellen said. I'm here to tell you the truth. The room fell silent. Doug manipulated the payroll system. Many of you were underpaid. Some lost hours. Some lost entire shifts. As of today, that ends. Whispers spread through the crowd. A few exchanged looks, others clenched their fists. We're already working to recover every missing dollar, Kellen continued. And we'll be adding compensation for the trouble. What happened wasn't just a mistake, it was theft. And I take full responsibility for allowing it to happen under my watch. Lewis crossed his arms. What about Doug? He's been terminated, and we're pursuing legal action. What he did wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. The young cashier shook her head. I always knew something wasn't right, but I didn't think there was anything we could do. You shouldn't have to fight to get what you've earned, Kellen said. That's my job. From now on, payroll audits will happen weekly with full transparency. If anything seems off, you'll have direct access to report it. From the back of the room, Rachel finally spoke. This is what makes people decide to stay or leave. If they see real change, this place could be different. Kellen met her eyes. Then let's make it different. An older employee, one who had worked under multiple managers, studied Kellen for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Guess we'll see if you mean it. Kellen nodded in return. As the team began to disperse, no one spoke loudly, no one celebrated. But something had shifted. It wasn't bright, triumphant hope, but a cautious sense of relief. Doug's damage ran deep, but now, for the first time, there was a way forward. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Moments of Quiet Truth, where every story is a chance to heal, awaken, and begin again with sincerity.